My friend Joshua Cutchin has a new book out called Fourth Wall Phantoms. The subtitle for that book is Reflections on the Paranormal, Narrative, and Fictions Becoming Fact. These are some of my favorite topics to ponder, so I'm really excited to have him on here today, but also because the themes of his book track so well with these new energies that we're having with Neptune in Aries and soon to be Saturn in Aries. We're getting a preview in 2025, but then that energy is going to be in effect for most of 2026, all of 2027, a good portion of 2028. And then Neptune remains in Aries until 2039. So we're really talking about a new era. And Joshua's book is just so timely for this. So welcome, Joshua. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It's such a pleasure to be here. I do plenty of podcasts, right? But it's always a special occasion when I get to have a show with someone whom I can consider a friend and who is in the book and and I've corresponded with both professionally and personally. It's wonderful. So I'm really happy to be here.
Great. Well, where should we start with it? There's so much in your
Yeah.
book.
Well, as we were saying earlier, this is still pretty early in my promotional cycle for it, so I don't quite have my feet underneath me as far as like, oh, this is the thing that I always say here or there. So, I suppose that a good place to start with it would be to sort of take a look at like what I try to do with myself, by which I mean everything about myself. I try to sort of really question and interrogate things spiritual, things religious, things in terms of relationships to really, see like, well, what do you think about this, Josh? What do you think about that, Josh? And so when I write books, one of the things that I do, one of the techniques that I do to sort of come up with books is I like to look at things that I'm not necessarily comfortable with, things that seem a little bit too odd, even for me, even though I'm into the paranormal. And one of those things has been these stories that you hear of fictional characters that come to life, and realities that become, or fictions that become reality. And again, I quote unquote believe in some very odd things, and I'm always sort of a pan paranormalist in terms of really being interested in UFOs and in cryptids and in ghosts and spirits and psi phenomena and even a little bit of astrology. So I wanted to say, well, what do I do with this? Like these stories exist and they're out there. What do you do with them? And I thought it was just a handful of stories, but it's actually an exceedingly common phenomenon. There are some books that predate mine that take a look at this phenomenon, and not only is it common, but it's also something that we can associate with some of our, um, most lauded authors and creative types. Alice Walker, Rudyard Kipling, I believe, Yeats. There's a bunch of different people who have sort of described this sort of boundary between their internal world and their external world really melting away. Everything from having a sense that characters want them to be written in a certain way, all the way up through oral manifestations that are heard and visual manifestations and sometimes full-fledged relationships with their characters. And so there are those stories, and then there are stories of people who wouldn't self-identify as creative types who see fictional characters, and it's like, well, what what does this say about reality? What does this say about those other topics that I'm interested in, like UFOs and Bigfoot and ghosts and things like that? And that's sort of how the project started and how it evolved. But as you know, I'm sure, well, as you're aware, since you've seen the book, that leads you into some strange territory indeed, and some pretty broad and large concepts about what reality is and the role that we play in, quite frankly, manifesting the world that we are living in.
Yeah, so I mean, I have been eagerly awaiting your book. As you know, as soon as I found out that you were working on this book, I was like, oh, yeah, I have to see this because I have what I thought was more of a unique issue than it turns out that it is, where if I write fiction, it comes true. Like it
Hmm.
starts showing up literally in my life or in the lives of clients or, people that are helping me on the book or whatever. So I one of the things that was actually really comforting to me in reading your book is finding out, oh, it's not just me. This is a lot of people, and you make some interesting parallels there just with the creative process and kind of imagination. Um, you have this great quote that the trickster is the patron saint of metalepsis,
Yeah.
and this tension between things that are verified as fact and things that are complete fantasy, but it's that like middle ground area where you can't quite
Yeah.
dismiss it, but you can't prove it. I feel like that's the part that is going to be so in effect in our world with Neptune and Aries. Neptune dissolves boundaries and is very tied in with the fantasy realm, with fairy, which I know you've also written about the fairy realm. Um, but Saturn is the planet of boundaries and limitations. And so much tension in your book really talks about language as inadequate to describe things like near-death experiences or certain like paranormal encounters, UFOs or visions or psychedelics, or there's a lot in that category. But it's a complex book. It's very, I mean, you read it with the diction. Well, at least I do. I have my dictionary nearby. um,
Yeah.
but metalepsis is a real key
Mhm.
or term in your book. Can you define that kind of, I mean, as much as you can
Yeah.
define metalepsis?
No, I'd be happy to. And before that, yeah, I mean, some of these topics are so sort of difficult to wrap your head around I really took a departure, in the way that I wrote the book, where there's a lot of me in there because I just wanted to sort of have it structured a little bit more like a conversation. Like, let me walk you through this because I really wish somebody had walked me through it. And to the other point that you made about the sort of the timeliness of it, yeah, we've had some conversations about how I apparently have a pretty good sense of intuition if you look at my chart.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't really realize that this was of the moment. I mean, I have a sense of it, and we can maybe get into that later. But like as far as from an astrological standpoint, I wasn't really aware that the timing was right. But it certainly feels right, in a more intuitive way as well. So yeah. So metalepsis is one of those concepts that we all know, even if we don't know the word. But we all do know it. It's a fancy way of saying breaking the fourth wall. And breaking the fourth wall, of course, is when roughly speaking, it's when a character acknowledges the audience. Although there are different variations of that. It comes from the theater, where there's this idea of you have the proscenium and the back the setting stage, and there's an invisible fourth wall between the audience and the characters. And breaking the fourth wall is when the characters acknowledge the audience. But since it can go beyond things as simple as characters acknowledging the audience, we've narratologists, people who study narrative, have actually redefined that term, and they don't usually use the term breaking the fourth wall as much as the rest of us do. They use this term metalepsis, and metalepsis encompasses any breaking of these boundaries that we erect in art. So anytime the frame is broken, so to speak, that is a metaleptic transgression. And by saying metalepsis instead of breaking the fourth wall, what you're actually saying is anytime a character acknowledges the audience, anytime the narrator acknowledges a character, anytime, vice versa. And there are different ways that this can go. There are literal books and books and books of essays and debate of all things over what does and doesn't constitute metalepsis. But, roughly speaking, you've got top down, where a narrator acknowledges the character, or bottom up, where the character is the one that actually breaks that that agreement, that frame. But also, outwards towards the audience, and sometimes even crossing over sideways into other properties, crossover events or spin-offs or something like that in a lot of our media. So metalepsis is the catch-all term for that. And, talking about boundary breaking, that ties into what you mentioned that I said about the trickster. The trickster is all over everything, really. But it certainly is all over the paranormal, in my opinion. And one of the chief defining characteristics of tricksters is breaking and transgressing boundaries. So it makes perfect sense that the paranormal would sort of do the same. Not only in this phenomenon of characters becoming embodied, but also, there's a very common thing that was said by the late paranormal researcher and author John Keel that, when you look at the phenomenon looks back at you, or the reflective phenomenon. In other words, you take an interest in these things, and these things encroach into your lives. And to me, I can't think of a more elegant way to describe how this sort of looking back happens in the paranormal than that idea of metalepsis, and the idea that you realize that you are embedded in a deeper reality. And as soon as you start to realize that and engage with it, it starts to look back at you.
Hmm. Yeah, and that ties into another astrological sort of mystery, which is, and I think Liz Green, she's a Jungian astrologer, but other people have noticed this as well, myself included, which is you would think, at least I would think, that the more conscious someone is, kind of the more they would direct their own lives. But often what happens is that the more inner work that people have done, the more shadow work, the more that they are engaged with like a deeper reality, the more they start to embody their natal chart and the more precisely they're impacted by transits. And if you think about it, I mean, I'm deep in the process of writing my own book right now, The Astrology of NDEs. And so I'm looking at these archetypes that are embodied in the astrology and how are they literally showing up in people's lives. And so yeah, I feel like you're like on the cutting edge, actually, very Aries, on the
Right.
cutting edge, like exploring a lot of this, what is it when we look at something and then it looks back, but it doesn't just look back. It's like it's interacting with your life. It's often showing up in quite literal ways. And so yeah, that's probably the most interesting part to me about your book is just what it says kind of about broader reality and how narrative kind of runs through all of that.
Yeah, I was thinking about this last night, actually, anticipating our conversation today, and about how, it's I think that there's such a strong parsimony and support for the idea of archetypes in natal charts and dispositions thereof, and vice versa, like the idea that you end up embodying these things even if you aren't aware of it. And then sometimes once you become aware of it, you look back and you're like, oh, I was all these things and I didn't really realize it. And it's not like you have your trajectory jerked back on course, but I do think there are certain ways that we're sort of guided to certain places, and coupled with our own dispositions, that certainly are a part of that. And yeah, this that's something that I was, alluding to earlier is the fact that, like, oh, we're starting with something that sounds as fun and far-fetched and lighthearted as, characters stepping off of screens or out of pages, but you do wind up in this, like, what are archetypes territory, and you wind up trying to sort of explore that. And things like retrocausality. I know you and I have talked about retrocausality. Some of that made its way into the book a little bit, but this idea that an event can happen in the future, and that's what inspires the art. So it looks like a fiction manifesting into our reality. And look, I'm convinced that that happens a lot of the time, because the work that's been done around that with Eric Wargo is really
Hmm.
strong, and I admire Eric's work. But you do look at something like archetypes or like natal charts, where people who have never ever ever had their chart read,
Hmm.
or have never produced one, will still do the things that are in their chart. And once somebody else looks at it, it's like, oh, that, aspects of their life make sense, and the decisions that they made. And to me, that does imply that there are other factors besides something like retrocausality, that are influencing us. And again, not a deprivation of free will, but certainly a nudging in certain directions, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, the whole destiny free will thing
Right.
is one of those questions that I don't think we're ever really going to have a
Mm-mm.
definitive answer to, because the moment that you think you have a definitive answer, then life kind of upends it, which is
Well,
why
it's like the it's
astrology. Oh,
it's like it's
God.
like it's like the UFO question, right? As soon
Yeah.
as you think you have it, you put some pressure on it, and it flies across the room like a watermelon seed, right? Like,
Yeah.
you can't hold it. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, or like Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It's like the closer you get, the more that you narrow down one end of the spectrum, then the other end is like, woo, doing all this other stuff.
Like squeezing a balloon, right? Like it just goes to a different part of the balloon. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But something that I found really interesting in your book too was this idea of like the series of things that are connected. So like a hierarchy within the archetype. And I know that plays out in astrology a lot because I mean you can draw a natal chart for like this chair that I'm sitting on, like when was this born and find somebody that was born on that same day. And obviously the person is going to experience life in a more engaged way than the chair, but you may find that like the chair has an accident or like, falls over at the same time that the person has the car
Mhm.
accident or and it comes up with time twins too, where people were born in the same hospital. My sister had somebody like this that they were born in the same hospital on the same day, like an hour apart, and they later met in life, and they were on the swim team, and they were always neck and neck in their races. Like one or the other would be the one that would win, and they got engaged within 2 days of each other. Their weddings were within a week of each other. I mean, it like when you look at some of that stuff, it's like, oh, wow, something is working here.
Mhm.
But at the same time, there's different levels that we can engage things on. And so, do you want to talk a little more about kind of those series or like, there's like an umbrella and then, lower and lower and lower down the series?
Right. Well, and then that's the other thing, that I find about things like the consistency of time twins and stuff is that like you've got that layer, and then you also have this layer where even when things aren't perfect matches, there are still symbolic aspects of each that are like basically the same thing. So, I suppose someone might have a falling out with a long-term friendship, and somebody might be, let go at a long-term job, but it's not the same thing, but it's still that sort of relationship and commitment being dissolved. So,
Hmm.
and again, that's very much, I think, like the paranormal as a whole, where you kind of have to like tilt your head and squint, and you're like, oh yeah, those are the same sort of things. But yeah, this concept, the Neoplatonists would have called it the Siri or the divine series, and I find it to be extremely compelling, and it is one of those sort of headwaters where astrology and Neoplatonism and Jungian psychology sort of all meet. And it was this idea that the Neoplatonists might have that everything is an emanation of these higher orders of existence, where you would have, this inexpressible one in the sort of a not monotheistic, but monist sort of sense, this sort of oneness, unus mundus sort of idea. Um, but then you'd have, a god, and then the manifestations of that god, and then people associated with it, and animals and plants, and then gemstones. So an example that I actually use in the book is that if you take a look at the sort of divine series of Pythagoras, you have, the divine series of Apollo, you have the solar god Apollo, you have the personification of the sun Helios, you have Pythagoras, who might have been, a vessel of Apollo or a manifestation of Apollo or a son of Apollo. Then below that, you have roosters, sunflowers, and golden gemstones, and these all sort of encode that idea of the solar, right? And this is an idea that was picked up in ceremonial magic, and is why you might, use certain gemstones to appeal to certain deities or certain forces. There's an idea that Jung found some sympathy with. He actually said, yeah, it does seem that there is sort of a hierarchical aspect to these archetypes. But for me, it sort of helps to explain, um, or helps to offer some insight, maybe, because we never really get explanations for these things, but it helps to offer some insight into these fictions that step into reality, these fictional incursions. And the example that I would sort of offer would be these ideas of these cultic variants. Like you would go to specific places in the classical world, certain places across Greece, and you would have a temple that was not to Poseidon necessarily, but to a specific version of Poseidon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a specific version of Athena or something. And, to the outsider, we in the modern era just think of we think of each of these characters as like monoliths. Like there was a Poseidon and there was an
Mm-hmm.
Athena, but like there were all these different versions of these gods and goddesses. And they were still prayed to with the same fervor that the titular ones were, but
Mm-hmm.
they were sort of these specific variants that were arguably kind of fictionalized versions of these other gods. But the way that the people in the ancient world would have explained this would be that they were part of that divine series that emanates from the Poseidon and the
Mm.
Athena, right? So I think that that's a very useful way to sort of look at well, it's a useful way, I think, to look at just sort of the symbolic nature of reality, which I become ever increasingly convinced of. But it does offer you some insight into sort of these archetypal forms and the ways that they manifest in our lives and such. And this idea that, I mean, it's kind of it's kind of an idea that harkens to the philosophy of idealism that everything is embedded in consciousness, or at the very least to panpsychism that consciousness is in everything. That there's some sort of I don't know really know if I want to go so far as to say autonomy, but some sort of a certain uniqueness to every object and everything that you can define and sort of have a degree of predictive power through things like birth charts for a chair.
Mhm. Um, so another thing that you really got into was this idea of the surrealist movement, which again I feel very ties into Neptune in Aries, Saturn in Aries, kind of bringing this like weird bizarreness into physical form in our consensus reality. But you really got into the purpose behind surrealism. So it wasn't just weirdness for weirdness's sake. But do you want
Right.
to talk a little more about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so a lot of people in sort of the circles that I travel in will say that something is surreal, and they sort of use that term interchangeably with just being bizarre. But that's not. I mean, that is as sort of a colloquial way to use it. But if you're looking at the art movement, that's not exactly accurate. Like surrealism had certain goals. Among them was to sort of unmoor assumptions and language from reality to get to that surreality, that greater reality, which again starts to sound a lot like the thesis for the book. But I think you could make a pretty cogent argument that some reoccurring themes in the paranormal space are not just bizarre imagery; they're specifically surreal imagery, imagery that you would find surrealists gravitating to in their art. And to that end, you have surrealist creators, artists, and filmmakers and whatnot engaging in techniques that do look like automatic writing or channeling or things like that, and just being led where they feel like they're being led. It's a bit like Jung's active imagination in that regard too. But the bizarre juxtapositions and beings and puns and certain taboos and childlike designs and things like that that you see in certain strains of surrealist art, you find all over this category of the paranormal, which is high strangeness,
Hmm.
which has gone by a lot of definitions. The actual phrase originated with ufologist J. Allen Hynek, who was trying to describe the really out there UFO sightings, but has sort of evolved over time to encompass this idea that some of these encounters seem to have sort of a dream logic.
Hmm.
There are these things that feel like jump cuts from a film, and of course, I'm using all these art comparisons specifically because like so much of these experiences do have that sort of artistic flair to them. But the sort of dream logic that you might have in a UFO encounter, discontinuities between I turned around and I was in a different room, or these sort of combinations of human and animal characteristics that you see in some of these stories. And I would argue that a great deal of things beyond just the UFO sphere do still have those high strangeness elements to it. You have people who, after engaging in, you know, engaging in, after they become psychonauts, basically, will notice, electrical malfunctions around them, which, like, why do those two things go together?
And could you define psychonaut for
Yeah,
people
sure.
that don't know that?
People using psychedelics, people entering altered states of consciousness for for exploration rather than
Okay.
just
Hmm.
recreational use. Yeah, and oftentimes those do involve pharmacological inductions. But so just you have these odd, like, sort of, you have UFO sightings that manifest poltergeist events, and you have people who, have these psychedelic trips and will obtain information that they shouldn't have any access to about, the death of someone that they hadn't heard about, but they hear about in this moment, and just these odd things where, it's this, it's almost like this singularity of time and space where anything and everything can and has happened that we enter into when we have a brush with the paranormal that comes out on the other side as high strangeness. And I've always really loved high strangeness stories, probably because it does have that sort of surreal, almost humorous aspect to it. But one thing that I say nowadays is that I'm always of a habit of believing experiencers. But when someone comes to me with, a rather conventional UFO sighting and, it sort of checks all the boxes, I'm like, okay, that's really interesting. But when they say, oh yeah, I saw the alien and it had a shirt that said "I heart New York," I'm like, oh, okay, I really believe you. Because like that's the thing that I find so attractive about high strangeness is that some of the details, some of those surrealist details, are so unintuitive and so odd, and they're these non sequiturs that you would never fabricate to make your story more believable, right? All it
Hmm.
does is make your story less believable, which makes me believe it more, that you are telling the truth. So yeah, that's sort of a little bit of a look into that, and to that extent, I think that perhaps the goals of these phenomena are the same as the goals of an artistic movement like surrealism, which is to sort of get us to disengage with a lot of the assumptions that we have built up through culture and language and to engage in something that is a little bit more meaning and a little bit more reflexive and a little bit more primal.
Yeah, so I think you know this about me that I had a brain injury in 1998 and I had no rational side for 4 years. Some people would argue I still don't have one, but because my life got a lot weirder, but it was really gone for 4 years, and I feel like that process was necessary for me because I was really pretty hyper rational and focused on this, academic track. Meanwhile, I was having precognitive dreams my whole life and, a lot of bleed through that I couldn't explain, but it was just kind of like, yeah, okay, that's that weird stuff and this is, this is my life. But um, I know Eric Wargo in his work has kind of made a connection where trauma, like a future trauma, reverberates backwards in time, and I've certainly noticed that. I mean, I have precognitive dreams like most days of the week. My dreams are precognitive, but what I find is that they're like precognitive in kind of a mundane way. Like, oh, I we were watching a show on TV and like I say to my husband, oh, I saw that in my dream this morning,
Mhm.
or that sort of stuff. But then what I really noticed, for example, the week that my mom was dying and then died and her funeral, all of these things which I had thought were just kind of random symbols in dreams over 2 years prior, they all it like avalanched in that whole week where everything was manifesting literally. And so in your research, how much of a like trauma or death, loss, trauma, death, those kinds of things, how much do you find that reverberates or creates this kind of split?
Yeah, I think that it's a hugely important aspect. We've talked, you and I have talked about, Ecology of Souls and that whole
Mm-hmm.
journey about my book connecting all these paranormal topics to death. But even beyond that, you know, uh, death is traumatic, but there are plenty of other traumas besides death, right? And this is something that's been debated a lot in these communities in general. Obviously the sort of collective belief of the parapsychologists is that trauma plays a role because why do we have so many murdered people showing up as ghosts and things like that, or
Mm-hmm.
lost lovers? I mean, these are stories that are trauma stories. The verdict is still out on the cryptid sightings, although a case can be made that there's plenty of trauma involved in those. But it has been a bit of a debate in the UFO circles about what sort of a role trauma plays. I tend to think that it plays more of an important role than people realize. For example, if memory serves, I was speaking to a UFO researcher who did a rather large longitudinal study of experiencers and said, oh, well, we don't, UFO experiencers don't have more trauma, specifically in this case, child abuse. They don't report more child abuse. It was only 20% of our respondents who indicated that. And it's like, oh, really,
Just
20%?
20%.
And then you factor in, the people who don't want to self-report in that way, people who have internalized this so that they don't realize that their trauma was trauma. And it certainly suggests that something like child abuse does play a role in these experiences. But I think that child abuse in the UFO sphere is not the question, nor is really trauma the question so much as it is dissociation, and the fact that anything that encourages a dissociative state that allows you to sort of step outside of yourself, of which unfortunately trauma is good at doing, can sort of kick your consciousness loose, unmoor it a bit, so that it can sort of access these other places and see these other spaces. So
Hmm.
I do think that it does play a role. An interesting comparison that I note later in the book is that there's a scholar, which I wish I could remember her name, but I don't have easy access to that part of my PDF right now. But there's a scholar who's taken a look at classical literature, Greek literature and whatnot, and has noted a trend where whenever a character is relating a story in some of these Greek epics and whatnot, and it's being retold as a story. Whenever there's a significant inflection point that involves trauma, it creates this break where sometimes the narrator reacts. And
Mm.
it's this idea that metalepsis can be a trigger. Sorry, metalepsis can be triggered by trauma in the story. And so if you sort of extrapolate that to our lives and to the paranormal, or, paranormal being used as a loose term for whatever forces, are above us, then yeah, it makes perfect sense that something similar would be happening, where there would be trauma would sort of be so confronting that it would sort of trigger a reaction from the cosmos. I mean, you find allusions to this, in the Christian Bible with, record my tears and those sort of phrases that happen. So I
Hmm.
think that there's something to it. I do think that there's something to it, and I'm not sure if it's. I've long suspected it's the dissociation angle, although if our lives do resemble something more textual, they resemble something more like a story or a narrative, then it might have something more to do with this phenomenon that we see in the literary space, where trauma sort of triggers a trauma triggers a break from one reality into the other. And like we've experienced, even if you haven't had supernatural experiences, like you've had this happen. Like I know most people I know have had fear or sadness like shock them out of a dream. Like that's the same
Hmm.
thing. It's being in one reality and the emotions actually pulling you from that reality into another reality. So it makes perfect sense to me that these things would be related.
Hmm. And then another topic that I found really interesting was this idea of ideas in search of people, and almost like a personification of the idea as like
Right.
on the hunt, trying to find people. Can you talk a little more about that and what's come up in your research?
Yeah, I mean, so there's something about this book, Laura, where I have really valued the writing of it, and I think that there's some insights in there that I love, but I'm going to have to step away from because I just I now exist in this sort of singularity, or this idea that everything is a singularity and everything is in this constant moment of every now, everywhere, every when. Um, and I don't know if I can continue to navigate life that way. And I say that because, like, yes, I do think that there are these ideas. If an idea can be thought, it already exists in some form or fashion.
Uh-huh.
I think I suspect that that's true, even though I might not engage with it in the future. And so, to that extent, yeah, sometimes these ideas might need someone to embody them forth. I mean, this is this is an idea that we see when we talk about, pre-birth memories in some
Hmm.
near-death experiencer circles, the idea
Hmm.
of people being assigned, parents and or choosing parents, or the idea that you decided to incarnate in this form at this point in time to experience these things. And I think that ideas might be something similar. It's kind of funny and ironic that I've come back around to this idea that a lot of skeptics use for these mass sightings of things like UFOs or like the miracle of the sun at Fatima. They say, oh, it was, mass hysteria. And it's like, well, what is mass hysteria, Mr. Scientist Man? You want to tell me exactly what that is? But this would be that. This would be that this idea has just sort of seized a group of people. And I suspect that if it seizes a group of people for long enough, then it sort of takes root in culture and becomes something like, the witch that dwells on the edge of the village, or the monster that dwells in that holler, or whatever. It sort of takes on a life of its own. And
Hmm.
similarly, to that extent, I kind of wonder. This is an idea that's a lot of speculation in the book. But one idea that I do play with that I find really attractive, is this idea that the whole book's about fictional incursions, these fictional characters and whatnot that step into our reality. Well, what happens when you have an idea that hasn't found a person yet, right? And that quote has been attributed to a lot of people, but supposedly at some point Carl Jung said people don't have ideas, ideas have people. So
Hmm.
what happens when you have an idea that doesn't have a person, that is just too impatient and wants to burst forth? Is that is what happens when that's a monster? If it's a person, he or she just blends into the crowd, but if it's a monster, like what happens then? And I kind of wonder, there are these different sort of one-off accounts that I love that I've found throughout the literature over the years, where there's this alien that's only seen at one point in, like, Toledo, and, and it's never seen again. And I kind of wonder if that was an idea that didn't have a person, was just too impatient and popped onto the scene and then disappeared again. Just a fun idea to have fun, pardon the punniness of it, but it's a fun idea to play with.
Hmm.
And I do like that idea, though, that ideas do exist discrete from us and come to us sometimes without us having much of a say in the matter.
Hmm.
And a lot of people I've talked to who are creative types will say that, their best ideas come to them all at once, fully formed. It's becomes much less an idea of it becomes much less inventing on the creator's behalf than it does, transcribing
Hmm.
or just replicating what's come to them. I hear that all the time.
That certainly has been my experience. So I'm like, who's writing this book?
Yeah, yeah,
So, yeah. But yeah, this idea of ideas in search of people, though, I kind of liken that in some ways to astrology transits too, because it's kind of like, well, if you don't believe in astrology, like it doesn't matter. But if Uranus is making a move in your life, you're going to feel it on some level. And there's different ways of approaching it. Like you and I both have big
Mhm.
Uranus things right now. Uranus is crossing your Mars, my midheaven, your moon. So like, I mean, that's some serious Uranus action happening in May 2025 and over the next couple years. But how do you engage that? I mean, Uranus can come like a lightning bolt. Uranus can come like a bunch of psychic downloads and brilliant ideas, or Uranus can come as total chaos and accidents that like create all kinds of upheaval in your life. And so, can we to some extent like court the nicer qualities of that as
Right.
opposed to just, being on the receiving end of the lowest common denominator that happens to, find a way into your life? And I don't have a
Right.
full answer to that, but
Yeah, it's a bit like the difference between you know, this is probably going to be a poor analogy, but it's like the difference between holding a metal pole in the air and like actually having a grounded house with a lightning rod, like allow it to pass through and not, char you to bits. Yeah.
mhm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's I mean yeah, it's and that's the $1 million question, right? Is like where does that stuff come from? And I think that again, to bring retrocausality into the discussion, I think that there is something to that with the art's already there and you're just bringing it into form. But as far as the origin point for that, I think that's still very much up for debate. It's kind of funny. I have had friends who are fiction authors, very much of sort of the skeptical atheist sort of disposition, who has said things to me like, oh, this character won't let me do this, or oh, this character won't let me do that. And I'm like, wait, do you hear what you're saying? And I have had that a bit myself. Over the course, I wrote a novel as well, just to sort of actually partially to court these experiences, right? And I did have a bit of that. Most often, surprise, surprise, on the cusp of sleep, in that sort of highly susceptible hypnopompic state. Um, and it's I kind of hate it because you have to write it down or else it's going to disappear. So you're
Yep.
half asleep. You're like, okay, I'll go ahead and write it down. And now I'm awake again. But yeah, I think that there is something to that. And for all we know, I mean, for all we know, so much of what we talk about in a field like astrology is just um, an attempt to describe these sort of things that we don't otherwise have words for,
Hmm.
that, obviously do have times and seasons attached to them as well that we can track through the stars.
Hmm.
But I am not sure it's one of those shortcomings of language. We just, as you alluded to earlier, language just seems to fail in this space, and we're just trying to track these things as best we can with the tools that we have.
When you were doing your research, I'm curious, did you ever come across the term ekphrasis?
Oh, I think I did, but I can't remember exactly what it means.
So this is what I wrote my
Yeah, can you school me
master's
on it? Okay,
thesis.
okay,
Yeah,
okay,
I
okay.
wrote my master's thesis on this. So it's ekphrasis, Ekphrasis, and it's the visual representation of verbal representation or the
Mm,
verbal representation of visual representation. So it's where those things cross.
right.
So like in a novel, I did it on Jude the Obscure, and photography actually plays a huge role in that book. And so there's descriptions of photographs, and so it's like the description of the art of photography within this fictional novel, but then it breaks that wall. It kind of plays with the way that the plot unfolds. And then in terms of, well, like my portal door here, I mean, I paint, and
Mm,
but all of the portal doors or canvases that I like turn into doors, they have a quote, and the quote is written out, but it sort of like reflects the intention of the piece or the other symbols in there. And I I mean, it's hard to, chicken or the egg, right?
right, right,
Is that causing the weird stuff to happen, or is
right.
it happening because like it all comes from the same place? Or I just wondered if you came across that.
No, I mean, I think I did, and sounds like, I kind of regret not exploring that a little bit more. But I mean,
Next
yeah,
book.
yeah, right. Next book. Uh, yeah, there's so many of these chicken and the egg questions. I mean, there's obviously a correlation if you look at the literature of people who have had a near-death experience and see a UFO, but sometimes people see the UFO first and then later have a near-death experience, and sometimes vice versa. I think that your work is suggesting that it seems like we're getting our cause and effect all scrambled up because it has nothing to do with either. You're just destined to have these things or you're not. Um, but yeah, and the sort of tapping into an idea like, this ekphrasis idea, or even just the fact that I'm willing to look at these experiences through that textual or narratological lens. I'm sure that there are plenty of people who would say, well, your life isn't a book, your life isn't a story, your life is, I mean, your life is a story, but you know what I mean? Your life isn't necessarily a narrative in that sense that we think of narratives. And I really kind of remain ambivalent on exactly what this means. I mean, what right do we have to look at our lives as narratives other than the fact that they just sort of feel that way to us? And is it art imitating life or life imitating art? Or, is it this sort of hermetic expression of, our fictions looking like our lives because that's what, as above, so below? I'm not really sure, but I do think that there's something to it that argues that we can view our lives through that sort of textual lens that we've created in the arts and in the humanities.
Well, and that brings us to an interesting point that you were also making in the book about the story, like the capital the story as
Yeah.
an archetype,
Yeah.
and that it behaves that way. And I have to say, I really resonated with that idea because I mean, I know in my own life, it's like paranormal every day. That's like, it's
Right,
like
right.
there's just so much weirdness that if I wrote it all down, it would be like 15 books. But um, even within that, there's certain, like, it seems like there's an underlying narrative that's not there all the time, but it pops up. And when it pops up, you know it. And
Yeah.
I noticed that in some of my clients' lives too, and some friends' lives as well. And sometimes it seems like the stories are interwoven together where, one person has a big breakthrough, and then like five of my clients have a big breakthrough at the exact same time. And it's like, okay, I was already linking you guys, but this is very interesting.
Yeah,
Like
that
if
is
this was a
interesting.
movie, we would be tracking multiple characters, or more like a series maybe
Hmm.
on TV where you're following, many characters' stories, but it's like, where's this going? Because they all kind of like interweave. I mean, in the case of my clients, I find it especially interesting because they don't know each other. Like the only connection that they have is me.
You're the hub of the
And
wheel. Yeah.
yeah, like it's blows my mind on a regular basis.
Yeah, and what I really like about that idea is that we can turn to stories to help us through our lives.
Hmm.
And we can turn to books and narratives to go through our lives. I mean, arguably any spiritual text, but if you look at something as simple and sort of universal as heroes' journeys and fairy tales, they do provide you, a blueprint for what your best course of action is. And I've experienced that firsthand in my life, as I, talk about in the prologue of the book, where, I was in the belly of the whale. I'm very open about it in a rehab center for alcoholism. But I really do attribute my continued recovery now, coming on 5 years on. I really attribute that to the fact that I sat down with my notepad in that setting and was like, okay, where am I in this whole, if my life is the hero's journey, where am I? And it's, it's
Hmm.
the belly of the whale. Like, and like here's the dragon. So what does the hero do at that point? And you have to find, your way out of it, and you have to seek wisdom and all those things. And there are different scholars who have sort of applied different models to that and different beats, but I think it does argue for the fact that at the very least our lives can be told through a story lens and can be enriched by sort of approaching them through that archetypal story lens, if not reality itself as a whole.
Hmm. Yeah, and I was gonna say your story, which you, I mean, so to back up, just to give people a little, insight into what we're talking about. So I interviewed you for my book
Hmm.
because you have done research on near-death experiences, and I've been finding a near-death marker in natal charts of experiencers. But was curious, would I find it in people who just research that topic?
Hmm.
And in fact, I have. It's in like almost 100% of the researchers and the NDEs, and it's not a common marker
Hmm.
otherwise. So that there is something going on there. But when we spoke on the phone and I was looking up transits, you shared your rehab experience, and we looked up transits and we talked about it. But you completely undertold that story.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, to be fair, no, yeah. I mean, I have so much of that, the prologue in Fourth Wall Phantoms, and I tell that story. It might come off at first as sort of self-serving, but it's to illustrate this idea that we do have this story running through our lives.
Hmm.
And so much of that is based directly off of all those notes that I took. Like there were things in there that I hadn't revisited those notebooks in a while. There are some things in there that I had forgotten. But yeah, it just I had to find the right time and setting and place. And like, again, because of that, some people don't want to hear what could come off as a sob story. So that's probably why I kept it close to my chest when we talked for the first time. But now you know all the details, so there you go.
Well, it was astonishing to read the story. And then I had your charts on a different computer, and I'm like reading your story on my desktop, and I'm like, wait a minute. I had to like go pull up your chart and all the transits, and then I was reading your story, and I was looking at my laptop and reading your story and going back and forth, and it tracks so. I mean, you're not exaggerating when you say that that was a death and rebirth experience. It plays out just like NDE transits, but you did it on the psychological level.
Yeah, I guess that comes back to me having a better sense of intuition than I give myself credit for, I guess. The fact that I just sort of made that because it was a me choice, and it was a me choice that I made in that moment. And I guess maybe something inside me since that happening. But yeah, that's what it felt like was a sort of death and rebirth, sort of, you know, a down payment to whatever this thing is. And you talk to I have plenty of friends who are ceremonial magicians and talk about uh certain offerings being made in different contexts, and it's the offering has to the best offerings are the ones that like are substantial and they mean something and they kind of like detrimentally impact you. And you know I suppose that the sacrifice that I made by giving up that part of my life and that tendency of mine must have made a pretty big splash because there was a very tangible sense of just otherness in my life on the heels of that. Just some really impressive synchronicities and whatnot. And yeah, I think that so that becomes the question too, like because you hear that with near death experiencers as well. Like they have synchronicities and a lot of strangeness happening
Hmm.
afterwards. So like what does it say that I had a similar transit but didn't do the near death thing but still had a death rebirth narrative and still have these after effects? I think it suggests that there is sort of that the universe runs on symbolism, right?
Hmm.
Like I think that like symbolism, meaningful symbolism, not
Hmm.
just slapping a picture on something, but like meaningful symbolism is like the thing that really makes the cogs move and the wheels turn, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, but who provides the meaning to it? I mean, it's
Right.
fascinating
Right.
in these situations because you were sharing how the woman that was it the receptionist or whoever was checking you into
Right.
rehab
Right.
was like a fairy,
Oh,
basically,
she
right?
was a huge fairy fan. Yeah, my the first person that I met on that journey, my intake specialist. She was like a huge fairy fanatic and had like Brian Froud tattoos on her, which is like so random. Like the number of people who even know who Brian Froud is, and somebody that I definitely know in my fairy travels and stuff. And was talking about how she joked about being a changeling as a child and stuff. In the last book that I had written at that point, the
Hmm.
last book that was out was Thieves in the Night, which was like my fairiest of fairy books. So it was
Hmm.
just things like that. And yeah, so that none of that would have had a meaning for anybody else. So I'm not like, I'm not so presumptuous as to say that she tattooed her body for me and was placed there right there in that moment for me, right? But it's just that intersection unfolded itself such that it had meaning for me in that time and space. Yeah, it really is. It really does become like this again, throwing causality on its head, chicken and the egg. It doesn't make any sense, and none of it will seem as profound to anybody listening as it does to me. I mean, I think synchronicities and dreams are like that. Like they're always like, they can be super meaningful to you, but sometimes when you tell them to other people that don't have that context and don't have that experience, they can lose a little bit of their luster. But it was very it made an impression on me, that's for sure.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I was curious, would you say that your book Ecology of Souls directly came out of that experience?
Oh yeah, I think it had to in some ways. There was sort of like I feel like there was this sort of sense of like you have to embark on something that's large and meaningful. You've had this idea for a while. It needs to exist because you came so close to to not being here. I mean, I think that those things were kind of running in the background. And also, I mean, I don't want to make it act like I don't want to make it act like I was brought to the brink of death or anything. But there is a sense of just when you're in that recovery situation, not in the necessarily immediate setting, but also the aftercare and whatnot. You have to sort of make some peace with dark things, things that we would consider dark, and
Hmm.
things like death. You have to make you have to get comfortable with seeing somebody come in and then go back out and come in and then go back out and then just sort of disappear and being like, well, I guess they're,
Mm.
lost on the breeze. So I think that like sort of that level of, sort of being forced to stare and actively staring at, this sort of final fate of us all probably had a role to play in that as well. Good
Hmm.
question.
Yeah, well, and not to keep bringing everything back to the astrology, but I mean, Pluto is the, Lord of the underworld, but also the symbolic realm, the deep, like the subconscious that comes up. Where so I do feel like we see Pluto because it's, the planet of death and rebirth and transformation. Of course, that's going to show up in near-death experiences or things like that. But back to the Neptune and Aries kind of energy that we're entering into. But Neptune is the planet most associated with addiction and alcoholism. And so, uh, you know, again with the different levels, it's like it's to me it seems like, oh well, he's engaging with Neptune in a different way now. You are like inviting the imaginal realm into your daily life. you're
Right.
you're like doing narrative intrusion into your own book to try to bring more of that into your life.
Right.
And
But it's
so
on my terms. I mean, maybe that has something to do with, with it, being, it's like fire, right? Like there's fire that you use to cook and that you use to heat your home, and then there's fire that like is out of your control, and you're like, whoa, I did not ask for this right now. So it's
mhm.
probably a bit like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So and also I think humility is a big part of any kind of recovery, right? I mean, the whole idea like with AA, there's this idea of, the higher power that you are constantly needing that support, constantly needing to connect to that. And so I do wonder with addiction, because I mean, I've had some clients who've had struggles with heroin addiction, for
Mhm.
example, not active users while they're working with me, but just what I find is those are some of the most spiritual people that I've ever encountered. And I'm like, well, you should just do Kundalini yoga. Like
Yeah.
there's, and but the same thing with alcoholism and this idea of spirits, right? Like you're
Hmm.
drinking
Hmm.
spirits, but to bring that down into like a different way of engaging. And so it just it seems like part of your personal transformation was engaging maybe on a different level of spirituality than just imbibing, right?
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting, like the number of, we can be dismissive about it and call it hallucinations if we want to, but the number of people that I spoke with in recovery who had encounters and were willing to share encounters that were straight up paranormal was really interesting to me. And I think that does speak to, well, I mean, it's sort of the psychonaut question that we that we had earlier, you don't think of, alcohol and heroin necessarily being hallucinogens or entheogens or any or anything like that, psychoactive in that sense. But like I think that anything like that that does sort of um wear away at some of those boundaries that we have between inner and outer and between, for lack of a better term, different worlds can sort of facilitate that.
Hmm.
And yeah, I've had people. I don't really think of myself as being, psychic or, especially in tune with this stuff. And I've had people be like, oh, a lot of people drink to sort of dull that out. And I'm like, I really don't think that was what it was. But maybe. And I do think that there is something about this that, has sort of replaced, that in my life, even though I was writing books while I was, drinking so much. I do think that this has been a positive place to sort of channel a lot of that energy too, which is sort of speaking to the idea of engaging with these spirits in a different way. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And as far as I mean, you kind of boldly claimed, and I'm not saying that it's unjustified because I can track it in your book, but where you say that Carl Jung literally saved your life. Do you want to talk a little
Yeah.
more about
Well,
that?
yeah, Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, and it was part of that. Yeah, so I'm surrounded by all these stories in rehab that are like they don't need to be forgotten. And on in terms of like the great story of life, but there are also things that I need to remember to sort of like bring me back to that time and place. So I just started writing and recording everything. From the cheesy motivational posters to some of the things that we learned in some of the mandatory classes and whatnot, but also just really, I guess, for lack of a better term, journaling. And there were parts of it, parts of that experience where I just, again, I had to sit down and roll up my sleeves and be like, okay, what am I tapping into? What am I embodying? What, again, the Joseph Campbell stuff, where am I on this hero's journey, and what is the pathway out? Like, and I think that it's not only a map for where to go next, but it's also, I think that something about reality in the universe or God, whatever you want to call it, wants you to follow those pathways. Like this is the path of least resistance. Like, this is this is the dry riverbed that's running through the landscape, and this, if you just follow this, everything will be a lot easier. And so
Hmm.
that's why it was like, oh, you kind of got to you face the dragon to defeat the dragon, but in sort of a something that kind of flips the whole AA message on it, or embraces the AA message while flipping the Jungian and the Campbellian stuff on its head. You've kind of got to you defeat the dragon by not fighting the dragon, by acknowledging that the dragon exists, and you are powerless over it. It's a bit like Luke Skywalker throwing away his lightsaber in Return of the Jedi, if you want to be a
Mm.
nerd about it. But like, and so just exploring those different avenues, and thinking about how exhausting that whole, emotionally and physically exhausting that whole my whole stay was. Just you can only hear these stories so many times before you're emotionally and mentally drained. And putting that in the context, or putting that in the context of rites of exhaustion that were meant to lead to spiritual revelation and things too.
Hmm.
I'm not saying that I was physically spent, but in terms of like just the energy that I felt was being pulled from my body, that was part of it too. So again, placing all that in that context was really what I do think saved my life, and guided me to the place, where I've been able to be sober for coming up on 5 years.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, yeah, I was actually really touched by your story in the prologue, and I'm sure you noticed this, but you talk about, is it patient
What?
180B?
Yeah.
And I was like, well, it's a 180 turnaround and
Oh
then
no, I
two
didn't notice
B.
that. I didn't notice that. No, no, I didn't notice that at all.
That was the
Um,
first thing I noticed. I was like, is he making this
no, that was that
up?
was that was actually my. I mean, yeah, I mean, some things in the beginning, just for sensitivity's sake, and the fact that we're dealing with real people, have to be sort of changed. But
Right.
everything about me is about me, and I had 180B written down, so I'm pretty sure that was my number. So yeah, I mean, it's just another little wink from the universe.
Yeah, and I did, again, I'm a nerdy English major, right? Before I had my head injury, this is what I studied, but I was studying it in text, and it's like, well, what
Right,
does this
and
little bit in this
yeah,
poem mean, and how does that react to over here? And
and
but
yeah,
if you look at reality as a text,
I was about to say, like, maybe
yeah.
that's the biggest lesson from all this, is that you can apply those sort of same lessons of meaning to life in general. I think they're most explicit in this sort of astrological paranormal space, but I think they can be applied to everything, large and small, that we
Hmm.
go through. And I think sometimes, there's an argument that I make later in the book, is I think that everybody who's listening, we've come a far way from fictional incursions. Right now, we're talking about like the meaning of life and all these different things. But that's sort of where the book ends up pushing you.
Right.
Um, I think that these experiences that we have with ghosts and monsters and flying saucers, I think they unfold in that space of meaning, and that's why you get all this strange symbolism and these sort of discontinuities that we're talking about. It's that space of meaning. The it's a space between the art and the audience, like that space where it's like the art doesn't necessarily have this, and it's something, but it's not necessarily fully formed in the audience either. But when they come together, there's this space of meaning that's created that that speaks to people, and the people, not only does the art project into the audience, but the audience projects into the art, and that middle in between space, the liminal space that we were talking about, is the space of meaning where the paranormal happens.
Hmm. Well, and you were talking about in order for a story to end, you have to omit things, and
Right.
that it's in the omission that, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong,
That's
but
right.
that it's in the omission that you get the reader or the audience participating because we have to use our imagination in order to fill in some of those blanks.
Yeah, I think that's entirely right. So to that extent, um, description is counterproductive to narrative, right? So because if you described every single thing, if I'm describing, Laura's room right now, I have to describe, well, there are, 42 leaves on the tree that's painted in this, or, and you get really granular and you just, it might be better descriptive, but it stalls the narrative out in its tracks. So
Hmm.
that to me suggests not only what you said about, that being a space and place to uh, kick fire this meaning, but or kickstart, is kickfire a word? Kickstart this meaning.
It is now.
But also I think that speaks to how uh it speaks to how we can talk about the paranormal happening in this, even coming from books which are full of words. It's not the thing that you're left with in a book. The fabula is not textually based. It's that's in between meaning space where you
Hmm.
meet with it. And so, like, it's counterintuitive because towards the end of the book I'm talking about how, as we've been talking about with language, some language and the paranormal don't necessarily mix, because that's the thing you hear over and over again is, I can't describe it, it defies
Hmm.
language, words fail. You hear this in every single sort of encounter, but at the same time, there's sort of a textual aspect to it because it's created in that in between space.
Hmm. And I'm curious too, in researching and pondering these things, how much does genre play into it? So this idea, like, okay, there's narrative, right? Narrative is running through our lives, and sometimes there's the big story that seems to be writing itself. But I know one of the things that I always ask is, okay, what kind of story is this? Like,
Mm.
is it a romance? Is it a love story? Is it a thriller? Is it like a, spy novel? Like what is it? Because I think to some degree, maybe to a large degree, that influences how we experience life, because you could have the exact same characters and basically the same plot, but if you're writing it in the genre of a love story, that's going to be a very different story than if it's just about war or something. A lot of love stories take place in war, but it's different
Right.
story than all the battles on the ground.
Well, it's like, when you see people who put horror film trailers, previews to happy music,
Oh.
or they put a romantic comedy to, like, horror film music, and it because suddenly becomes a show about a movie about a stalker, right? It is kind of that. And I do kind of wonder that, is what is genre, is genre anything beyond perspective? That's part of the question, I think.
Hmm.
And when I think of the dull gray days of my life, which, I think we all have, some of us more than others. There are always the days when I don't know what genre I'm in. Like, this is just an idea that just came to me, but I think that maybe, like, sort of, if I can overlay a genre on those weeks that seem like I'm just going through the motions, maybe that'll make them a little bit more interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's
But yeah, is genre anything other than perspective? That's a good question.
yeah. So I'm not sure. I have more questions. As I told you, my printer kind of
No, I mean,
exploded. So
I think we discussed, so, and it's a pretty comprehensive look. We have come to a place where it is a comprehensive look at the bigger themes of the book. I mean, like, so in case anybody's wondering, yes, there are plenty of stories, fun stories, in the book about people seeing, Aquaman and John Constantine and just sort of the way that these topics are in dialogue with our art and media. But in terms of like the where I wanted to go, and where I always want to go with my books, like this has been incredibly comprehensive in that regard. It's a lot like I took a page from our mutual friend Mike Cleland a long time ago, where he was like, if you're having a conversation with someone and you're talking about UFOs and you're talking about anti-gravity technology and propulsion tech and stuff, and you don't wind up on these bigger questions, these questions of like, what's the universe like, what's God like, what's where are we going, what is reality, it might not be the best conversation you can be having about UFOs. And so I
Uh-huh.
think that we've arrived at that place for sure.
Well, good. And I definitely would love to have you on again closer to the time when my book is done,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
I think between your Ecology of Souls and the work that I'm doing, I mean, that's a whole different thing. We touched on it a little bit, but there's so much there that I think could be a really interesting talk.
Well, I have been privileged to get to know a couple of different people who have some really interesting projects coming out. A good friend of mine has a Bigfoot book that's coming out that I think is it's going to be one of the best Bigfoot books ever written. But I am also extremely excited for your book on astrology and near-death experiences, because I haven't heard anything about it, or anything quite like it, and I think that it's one of those frontiers that is worth exploring. And from what little I know, it has the potential to really it has the potential to help us ask better questions, which I think is all you can ask for about something in this space. So I'm really excited about it, and I hope to be able to help in any way that I can.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
You've already been great help. But as I was preparing questions for today, I kept wanting to ask all these other questions, but I was like, no,
Right.
no, this is about fourth wall phantoms primarily. So I hope we did it justice. It's a great book. Definitely will make you smarter. It will it's good exercise for the brain. I feel all of your books really are.
Well, thank you so much. And I it it would be I had a this is the first book where I actually like really did a lot of one-on-one interviews with people, and you appear at two places to make some really important points. So I'm very grateful for your participation in that, and it's allowed us a chance to get to know each other better, which has been a reward in and of itself.
Yeah, it's been great. So, thanks again so much for coming on today. And until next time, peace.
Sounds good.
All right, take care.